beaten blind in one eye by a drunken stable boss. A cowboy said it right and gave her sight again. The letter from my brother came on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because the freighter wagon had just rolled through, and Tuesdays were the only day Marta Shell opened the post window before noon. The envelope was thin. 1 page. He'd sold the spread near Laramie, my half included, it turned out, and had nothing left to send me but the news and an apology. 2 lines of apology. He filled the rest of the page with excuses. I stood outside the post office in Cutter's Fork, Wyoming, and I read it twice. The wind was coming off the flats, dry and cold, and it pulled at the paper. I folded it along the same crease it came in and put it in my coat pocket. Then I stood there a while longer, which was not something I was in the habit of doing. I was 53 years old. I had $41. The horse I owned, a blue roan named Patch for the white on his shoulder, was worth maybe another $30 if a man wasn't in a hurry to sell. $70, give or take, was the sum of what I had after 30 years of wrangling, trailing cattle, punching fence line, and mending whatever needed mending on whatever outfit would hire me. 30 years of being useful and reliable and never causing trouble, and what it had come to was a thin letter and a cold wind. I'd been counting on that land. Not much land, 60 acres, mostly slope and rock, but there was a creek on the lower third, and I'd had a thought of running a small herd. Small and mine. I was old enough to know that the only thing worse than a hard life is a hard life with no end to work toward. I'd told myself for years that the land was waiting, that when I was ready, it would be there. That had been the thing I'd been working toward, even when I wasn't saying so. Now it wasn't there. The letter went to ash that night in the stove of the room I rented above the saddle shop. I didn't feel much as I watched it go. That was the part that bothered me most. I'd expected to feel rage or grief, and what I felt was something quieter and worse. Like a lantern turned down to nothing. Like a man who'd been walking somewhere for a long time and had just now noticed the road had stopped and there was no more road. I went to bed at dark. I lay there and listened to the saddle maker move around below me, the creak of his floor, the tap of his tools. He worked late, that man, a careful craftsman who wouldn't leave a stitch undone. The sounds were regular and human, and in the dark they were a small comfort, though I'd have been hard-pressed to explain why. And I thought, in the morning I'll do something, I'll think of something. But I didn't, not really. I worked a few days helping the livery man clean stalls when his boy was sick, and I ate, and I slept, and November came in cold and hard. Something in me had gone flat. I didn't have a word for it. I just moved through the days like a man walking in water, everything taking more effort than it ought to. I'd always been a man who woke before the light and got up moving. Now I lay there looking at the ceiling until I couldn't justify it any longer. That was new, and I didn't like it, and I didn't know what to do about it. It was the second week of November when I first saw her. She was coming out of the mercantile with a crate of goods, too heavy for the way she was having to tilt to manage it. I was on the boardwalk heading the opposite direction, and I would have walked right past except the crate slipped and I caught it. Reflex. I've spent too many years catching things that fell. I took it from her and she said, "Thank you, you can set it there." She pointed to a wagon at the rail. I set it in the wagon bed and straightened up and looked at her. She was maybe 45, lean through the face, brown hair going to gray at the temples, and she had a way of holding herself very level and still, like a woman who had learned to stand on uncertain ground without showing it. There was something wrong with her left eye. The socket around it was faintly misshapen, old damage, not fresh, and the eye itself had a clouded quality to it, a white-gray cast over most of the iris. She wasn't blind in it entirely, but she wasn't far off. She was angling her head just slightly, all the time, without seeming to know she was doing it, putting her right eye forward, compensating. She caught me looking and didn't flinch from it. "I'm me Aldrin," she said. "I keep the house at the end of Birch Street. I do herb medicine and wound tending when Doc Ferris is drunk, which is most of the time." She said this matter-of-factly, the way a person tells you a thing they have long since made their peace with. "Callum Ware," I said. "I'm nobody particular." She looked at me with her good eye, her right, which was dark and steady and didn't miss much. The kind of eye that had learned to do the work of two. "You're the man who's been working the livery. When they need me." "You look like a man who needs some soup," she said. "Come along." I don't know why I went. I was not in the habit of accepting from strangers. But there was something in the way she said it, not pity, not charity, more like a woman who had decided a thing and was stating it. Like the soup was already made, and the bowl was on the table, and it would be wasteful not to eat it. I was tired enough that wasteful seemed like reason enough. I ate soup at her kitchen table, and she told me about herself without me asking much. Her husband had been a doctor, a real one, trained back east. He died 4 years prior of a fever that came on fast and took him in 6 days. She had kept on with the herb work because it was what she knew, and because the town needed it, and because, I think, stopping would have meant something she wasn't ready for. She did not seem to want sympathy about any of it. When she mentioned her husband, his name was Emery. It was the way a person mentions a tree that used to stand in the yard, present by its absence but not a wound. "What happened to your eye?" I said. I said it the way she would have said it, plain and without ceremony. She didn't look surprised. She looked at her cup first, then at me. "Josiah Pelter. He ran the stable 3 towns over in Renner. I'd gone there with my husband, this was 6 years ago now, to tend a man who'd been kicked by a horse. Pelter was drinking in the stable and got it in his head that I'd looked at him wrong. He hit me with the back of his hand. My husband came in at the wrong moment and Pelter hit him too, and my husband fell against the stall post, and that was how he broke 2 ribs. She paused. The eye never came back right. There was a doctor in Cheyenne who said he thought he could help, but the cost was beyond us at the time, and then Emery died, and I never went back to thinking about it. Pelter ever answer for it? Not to my knowledge, she said. He was a large man with large friends. Where is he now? I expect he's still in Renner. She looked at me with that steady dark eye. Why? No reason, I said. She poured more soup. I went back to her house most evenings for the next 2 weeks. She never made a thing of it, never fussed or set a ceremony around it. I'd come to the kitchen and she'd be working, grinding something in a stone bowl, or straining a tincture through cheesecloth, or making up bandage rolls from old linen that she cut and hemmed with efficient little scissors, and we'd eat and talk or not talk, and after a while I'd go. The walk back to the saddle shop was cold and I didn't mind it. I felt less hollowed out walking back from her house than I felt walking away from anywhere else. She was easy to be around the way a fire in a cold room is easy to be around. You don't analyze it, you just stop being as cold. She had strong opinions about things, about what the territorial government was doing wrong, about the price of lamp oil, about a feud between 2 families on the north side of town that half the town was pretending not to notice. She wasn't loud about her opinions. She'd state them once clearly with evidence and let you think what you wanted. That was a quality I respected. I've known people who carry opinions like weapons and swing them at everything. Me carried hers like tools. She got them out when they were useful and put them away when they weren't. She asked me once about the 3rd week, what I was still doing in Cutter's Fork. Nowhere else to be, I said. That's not the same as staying somewhere, she said. No, I said, I guess it isn't. She let it alone. She had a gift for knowing when to let a thing alone. I've met damn few people who had that gift, man or woman. I was splitting her firewood by then. Her woodpile was low and she had no one to do it, and I had hands and a maul and more hours than I knew what to do with. It was good work, something to push against, something that showed. You split a cord of wood and it's there. You can see it and you can smell it, pine and fir, different smells, the fir slightly sharper, and you know it'll keep somebody warm through weather that would otherwise be a misery. I hadn't felt the satisfaction of that in longer than I wanted to admit. She watched me split wood one morning from the kitchen window. I didn't know she was watching until I looked up. She didn't look away. She just nodded once, the way a person acknowledges something done right, and went back to her work. One morning I walked past the post office and there was a notice on the board. The county road crew was taking on men for the winter, laying culverts on the North Road, cold and miserable work, but it paid 65 cents a day. I stood in front of that notice for a long time. The paper was water-stained at the corner. Someone had already torn off one of the address tabs. I didn't sign on. I'm not entirely sure why. Part of it was that going to the county road meant leaving Cutter's Fork, and leaving Cutter's Fork meant leaving those evenings at me Aldrin's kitchen table, and I wasn't ready to look at why that mattered as much as it did. I went and split more firewood instead. The trouble came at the end of November, on a night cold enough to snap the tree sap. I've been playing cards with 2 men at the saloon, just passing time, small stakes, the kind of game where you're not really there for the cards. One of the men, a teamster named Gall, took it into his head that I'd been signaling to the other player. I hadn't been. I'd been winning because Gaul was drinking too much and playing badly, and a man who drinks too much and plays badly always needs a story to tell himself about why he lost. I know the type. I've seen it 100 times across 100 card tables, and I should have found a reason to be elsewhere earlier in the evening. He came across the table at me. I got up fast enough to take most of his weight on my forearm instead of my face, but we went backward over my chair and hit the floor, and the table came with us. His elbow caught me in the chest, wrong spot, wrong angle. I felt something give. Not a break, not the full crack of a bone breaking clean, something worse in a way, a dull wrongness that spread when I breathed. I walked back to my room above the saddle shop. The stairs took a while. I sat on the bed and thought about things, and by the time I'd thought about them, my breathing had gotten tight and high and wrong, and I knew I'd cracked something in there. The ribs have a particular feeling when they're damaged, a bright line of pain on the intake that your body tries to work around. So you start breathing shallow without deciding to, and then the shallow breathing makes everything worse. I sat like that for probably an hour. I did not go to Mies. I didn't want to be seen like this. That was the thought I had, plain and honest with myself, alone in the dark. I didn't want her to see me down and broken and with nothing, because that was all I was, and I knew it, and I was not ready to have her know it too. I'd been coming to her kitchen for 3 weeks, and I'd been useful and steady, and I'd split her wood and listened well, and I wanted to be seen that way, not this way. I lay down on the floor because the bed was too soft and I couldn't breathe lying flat. The floor was cold and hard, and I pulled my coat over me, and I thought about the 60 acres that didn't exist anymore, and about the road crew notice on the board, and about $41 and a blue roan and no road. I don't know when she came. I heard the door and I heard her cross the room, and she was kneeling beside me before I'd gotten a word out. "I can see your light," she said. "You've had it burning 2 hours past when you're usually dark." She had brought her bag. She was already getting into it. The bag was old leather, soft with use, and she moved through it the way a person moves through something they know by touch. "I'm all right," I said. She made a short sound. Not quite a laugh. "You are not all right, Callum." She ran her fingers along my ribs, and her touch was quick and sure, not hesitant, not gentle in a way that wasted time. She found it fast, just below the sternum on the right, and the flinch happened without my permission. "Cracked," she said. 2, maybe 3, you need to breathe slow. Don't fight the pain, breathe slow and let it come. "I've cracked ribs before." "I know you have. Do what I tell you anyway." She put a folded cloth under my head. She'd brought one, I noticed. She'd come prepared, like she'd expected to find a man down, like this was just part of what she did in the world. She began wrapping me in a long strip of linen, tight around the chest, but not so tight I couldn't breathe, and her hands were very sure. She wrapped the way a person wraps who has wrapped 100 times. No excess motion, no fussing, the end tucked and held without being told to hold. I said, "I'm sorry." She stopped wrapping. "For what?" "For being like this, for being—" I stopped. What I had been about to say was a long thing, for having nothing, for being nobody, for being a man of 53 years who was lying on the floor of a rented room with $41 and a cracked chest and nothing at all on the horizon, for coming to her kitchen and eating her soup while I was slowly, quietly deciding that the road was done. I didn't say any of that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Callum, look at me." I looked at her. She was very close, kneeling right beside me, her dark eye steady, and that clouded left one turned slightly away from direct light the way she always held it. In the lamplight, the clouded one looked almost silver. "You have been the first decent man who has walked through my door in 4 years, she said. "You split my wood without being asked. You fixed the hinge on my cellar door that has needed fixing for 2 winters. You listened to me talk about Emery without pity in your face, without the careful look people get when they think you might weep and they don't know what to do about it." She paused. "You are not nothing." I didn't say anything. The tightness in my chest was not only the ribs. "But you are going somewhere you shouldn't go," she said. "And I have watched it happen these past few weeks. You are deciding to stop." She put her hand flat on the wrapped linen over the place where the ribs were bad, not pressing, just there. "I need you to not do that." The way she said it, "I need you," landed differently than I expected. Not plea, not guilt, not the soft pressure of someone trying to make you feel obligated. Just a woman stating a plain truth with steady hands and both eyes on you. "All right," I said. She finished wrapping me. She stayed the night in the chair by the stove, wrapped in her own coat, her bag at her feet, her head tilted to her good side the way she always rested. When I woke in the gray early morning, she was already awake. She had put more wood in the stove without being asked. She was watching the window, where the first thin light was coming up gray and cold. "You stayed," I said. "Yes," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know that," she said. And she said it the same way she'd said every other plain thing, like it was simply true, and true things didn't need dressing. I was laid up most of December. 3 cracked ribs. It turned out the middle one had a thin fracture running most of its length, and Haverfield later told me I was lucky it hadn't shifted. Me came every day. She brought food and medicine, and sometimes just herself, and she sat in that chair by the stove, and we talked or didn't talk. We talked about her husband's years practicing medicine, the hard ones early on before anyone trusted him, before the town decided he was worth believing in. We talked about my years on the trail, the different outfits, the different country. Texas and the Panhandle and the Dakotas, and 2 seasons in Montana that I'd mostly blocked out on account of the cold. She listened the way good listeners listen, not waiting for her turn, actually listening. Sometimes in the evenings she'd read aloud from a small book of poetry her husband had kept. She'd find a thing she thought I'd like and just start reading it, and when she was done she wouldn't explain or comment on it, she'd just let it sit in the room for a minute. That was a good habit. I've had people read me poems and then tell me what they meant, which ruins them entirely. My breathing came easier by Christmas. I could move around. The hollow feeling I'd carried since my brother's letter, that lantern-down feeling, had changed somehow. Not gone, but different. Less like a road that had stopped and more like a man who had stopped walking and was standing still, looking around, and finding that there was more to look at than he'd noticed while he was moving. What I could name, clear and specific, was the thought that had been sitting in the back of my head since me first told me about her eye. There was a doctor in Cheyenne who'd said he thought he could help. I'd been asking around quietly. The man's name was Haverfield. He was still there, still practicing, from what I could find out, with a good reputation and no scandal attached to it. He'd trained in Vienna, which meant nothing to most of the territory, but meant something to people who knew anything about eye medicine. What they also said was that it cost considerably. His rate was not the rate of a frontier doctor who'd learned on the job. I did the arithmetic, the surgery, the travel stage to Cheyenne and back, which was 3 days if the weather held. A place for her to stay in Cheyenne while she recovered. She'd need at least 2 weeks. Anyone with half a brain could see that. You don't operate on an eye and then put a woman on a stage the next morning. A place for me to stay too, because I was not going to leave her alone in a city she'd never been to with a bandaged eye. All of it came to somewhere between $120 and $140. I had $41. It snowed hard through January. Cutter's Fork got quiet the way frontier towns do in hard winter, people hunkering, wood smoke thick in the air all day, the streets half empty most days and the boardwalks creaking with cold. The saloon still did its business, but even it had a muffled, inward quality, men sitting close to the stove and not talking much. I took any work I could find. I helped the livery man through a bad month when 2 of his horses took sick, colic in both, a misery to manage, long nights walking them to keep them moving. I repaired harness for 3 different outfits at 20 cents a rig, working in the cold of Birch's barn with my fingers going numb and then warming them at a small stove he kept in the corner and going back at it. I helped the man who ran the dry goods store build a new storeroom addition, rough carpentry, nothing fancy but solid. Square walls, level floor, things that would stay. I was careful with what I spent. Not stingy, I paid my rent and ate, but careful. No card games, no extras, nothing I didn't need. When the weather was too bad for outside work, I mended things, my own gear, Birch's tack, anything I could get my hands on. I kept a small ledger in my head, what came in, what went out, what was left. I've kept ledgers in my head my whole life. When you don't have much, you count it careful. Me watched me working without asking. I hadn't told her the plan. I didn't want to tell her until I could tell her it was done or close enough to done that it was real. I'd had too many things fall apart in the gap between planning and doing to make a promise I couldn't keep. One afternoon in early February, she came into the livery while I was there and she said, "Callum, what are you doing?" "Working," I said. "You've been working like a man trying to prove something," she said. "What are you saving for?" I looked at her. She was wearing her heavy coat, her breath misting, her good eyes steady on me. She was not going to be put off with nothing, and I knew it. "A thing," I said. She looked at me for a long moment with that right eye of hers. It was a look that could take a man apart if he let it. I held still under it. Then she said, "All right," and went out. She knew how to let a thing alone when she chose to. That was its own kind of trust. By the end of February, I had $93. The snow was beginning to ease, the days getting a thin edge of warmth by afternoon. I thought about the road crew job. It was still running. They'd gotten behind on account of the weather, and they needed men for the final push before the thaw. 6 weeks of work at 65 cents a day would put me close to 125, maybe 130 if the weeks were full. I rode out to where they were working and talked to the foreman and signed on. It was cold, miserable work, as advertised. We were laying culverts through ground that hadn't fully thawed, breaking frozen earth with picks and spades, your arms going wooden after the first hour and the cold getting into every joint by noon. We slept in canvas tents on frozen ground. The food was hot and there was enough of it. The cook knew his job, but everything else was hard. I was the oldest man on the crew by a good 10 years, and 2 of the younger ones made something of it early on, the way young men will when they think age is a weakness. One of them, a loud kid from Nebraska named Decker, said something the second morning about whether the old man could keep up. I didn't say anything. I just worked. By the end of the first week, Decker had stopped saying things. Hard work is one of the things age doesn't take from you, provided you've never stopped. Your joints ache more and your hands crack sooner and you sleep harder at night. But you know how to pace, how to save what you need, how to keep moving through the hours that make young men falter. I've cracked my way through harder things than a frozen ditch. I thought about me through most of it, the way she'd said, "I need you to not do that." The way she'd sat in that chair all night with her coat around her by the stove. A woman who had decided something and was staying with her decision. I thought about what she'd said, the first decent man through her door in 4 years. I knew enough about loneliness to know what that cost a person to say. Loneliness doesn't get easier the longer it goes on. It gets harder to admit. You build habits around it, ways of managing, and then someone asks you how you are and you say fine because you have been saying fine for so long you've almost convinced yourself it's true. She hadn't said fine to me. She'd said asterisk, "I need you asterisk," plain as a nail. At night in the tent with the wind working at the canvas, I ran the numbers. I was meticulous about it. Every dollar accounted for. I had a small notebook, 3 inches by 4, water-stained cover, and I kept the count in pencil. It is a precise kind of satisfaction, keeping count toward something specific. Every day was 65 cents closer. You can live on that, the knowing of it. I came back to Cutter's Fork at the end of March with $118. I needed a few more. The answer came sideways, the way answers sometimes do. Hector Birch, the livery man, had been talking all winter about needing a permanent hand. Someone steady for the evening feeding and the early morning. Someone who knew horses well enough that he could trust them with a sick one. His usual help was his own son, but the son had married and moved to his wife's family's place near Laramie in the fall and hadn't come back. Birch offered me $1 a week plus the room above the saddle shop at half rate, effective immediately. I said yes, that put me over. $131. I told me on an evening in April when the last of the mud was drying up, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going green, and the air had that particular quality it gets in early spring on the plains, like the whole country had been holding its breath for 4 months, and just let it out. We were at her kitchen table. She had made coffee, and there was a piece of dried apple cake she'd put together from nothing particular. Outside the window the evening light was long and going orange, the kind of light that makes the plains look like something a man could be satisfied with his whole life and never want more of. I said, "I want to tell you something. I want you to hear all of it before you say anything." She set her cup down. She looked at me. "When me, Aldrin, decided to listen to you, you had the full weight of it. It was not a comfortable thing, that attention, but it was the best kind." I told her about the money, the winter working and the road crew and the livery job. I told her what Haverfield in Cheyenne was said to be able to do, not as rumor, but as careful asking, as the specific reputation of a specific man who had trained in a specific place and had a record that bore looking into. I told her I'd written him a letter 2 weeks ago and gotten a reply, that he believed he could help her given what I'd described, that his rate was $100 for the surgery, and that the rest would cover the stage and the board and 2 weeks in Cheyenne while she recovered. I said, "I have $131. I believe it's enough with some left for the unexpected." She was very still. She didn't say anything for a long time. I listened to the creak through the window, the small sound of it. "Callum," she said finally, "you said once the cost had been beyond you. It isn't beyond me." I paused. "Not now." "Why?" she said, not hostile, genuine, asking as a woman who needed to understand the thing completely before she could decide what to do with it. I thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually thinking. Then I said, "Because you sat in that chair all night and you told me not to stop. Because a man who's been told that by a woman worth the telling, he owes it to her to stand up straight and do something worth doing." I looked at her. "And because you've been seeing this world with one eye for 6 years, and you don't have to." She looked at the table. She was quiet in a way that wasn't empty, it was full of something, turning something over. Then she looked at me. Her right eye had gone bright. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything yet," I said. "Sleep on it." She slept on it one night. The next morning she knocked on the door of the room above the saddle shop at 7 o'clock, and when I opened it she looked at me with that steady dark eye, and then she said, "All right." Just that, but the way she said it, the way a person says a thing they've decided all the way down. We rode to Cheyenne on the stage in the first week of May. Me had never been on the stage before, which surprised me. She sat very straight and watched the country go by with her good eye working hard, the way it always worked, compensating, taking everything in. She asked me the names of things, the different grasses, the shape of the breaks along the far ridge, a hawk riding a thermal off to the south. She named it a red tail before I did. "Sharp eye," I said. "One sharp eye," she said. She said it without bitterness, just accurate. Cheyenne was bigger than anything she'd been in for years. The streets were loud and the buildings were tall, and there were more people in one block than lived in all of Cutter's Fork. She stayed close without being visibly nervous about it. She watched things. In a hat shop we passed, she stopped and looked at a window display. Just looked at it for a moment, this small arrangement of hats and ribbon, and I stood beside her and didn't say anything. Haverfield was a small man with white side whiskers, very clean hands, and the air of a man who had been right so often he had stopped needing to announce it. He looked at me's eye for a long time with a lens on a wire stand, turning it this way and that, asking her to look here to follow his finger. He was quiet while he worked. Then he looked up and said, "The structure is intact. The clouding is what I have seen before. I believe I can address it." Me looked at him with her one good eye direct, no give in it. "Will it hurt?" "Yes," he said. He seemed to respect her for asking directly, for not dressing the question up as something softer. "All right," she said, same as she'd said to me. The surgery took most of a morning. I waited in the outer room. It was a small room, 4 chairs, a table with a lamp on it, a print of a mountain on the wall. I sat in one chair and then another one and finally went back to the first. The lamp needed trimming and the wick was throwing a faint smell of char into the room. I am not a man who prays much, but I did something close to it sitting in that chair. I thought about the way she'd wrapped my ribs in the dark of that November night, her hands sure and quick. I thought about the soup. I thought about a man who'd had 60 acres and a cracked chest and $41, and the hollow feeling of a lantern turned to nothing. And I thought, some things you do and they work out and you are glad. And some things you do and they don't, and you are still glad you did them, because a man who sits still and waits for certainty before he acts ends up sitting still forever. The Cheyenne clock on the wall ticked. Someone walked past in the hall outside. I turned my hat in my hands. When Haverfield came out, he said, "It went well. The lens membrane was opacified, clouded over from the impact. I've cleared it. She'll need 2 weeks with the eye bandaged. After that, we'll see what we have." 2 weeks in Cheyenne? I'd accounted for it. There was a rooming house near Haverfield's office run by a woman named Mrs. Pitcher, a tall woman with a Scottish accent and a very clean house who took in respectable tenants and had no patience for those who were not. $4 a week per room. I had 2 rooms. Me spent those 2 weeks with her left eye bandaged. She was mostly good about it. When she wasn't, she was honest about not being good about it, which is better in the end than someone who pretends. "I keep trying to look out of it," she said one evening, "and there's just nothing there and it wrong-foots me every time." She said it flatly, not looking for comfort. 2 weeks, I said. "I know," she said, "I know." I read to her in the evenings from the Cheyenne paper. She had opinions about everything in it, the territorial news, the land debates, a story about a railroad dispute she followed over several days with increasing irritation at all parties. We played cards. I had to hold her hand and let her feel the cards by touch, which was the best card game I have ever played. She won more than I did. I suspect she wasn't as blind to the cards as she let on, but I didn't press the matter. On the 12th day, Haverfield took off the bandage. Me sat very still in his chair. He shone a small light at the eye. He moved it slowly. He held up fingers at different distances. He stepped back. "Can you follow my finger?" he said. She did. Her eye tracked him, slow at first, then steadier, like something coming back online after a long time unused. The clouding was mostly gone. There was a faint haze at the edge of the iris, but the center was clear and dark brown, nearly black, the same as her right eye. She sat there for a moment without speaking. Then she turned and looked at me. Both eyes on me for the first time. The full weight of both of them, dark and steady and bright with something I was not going to try to name. I don't have a word for that moment. I stood there and let it happen to me, and I didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. Then she stood up from the chair, and she came across the room, and she put her arms around me, and she held on. Tight, the way a person holds onto something real and doesn't want to drop it. I put my hand on the back of her head. She was shaking a little. I held on too. Haverfield had turned to look out the window, and was apparently finding the Cheyenne Street very interesting. After a while, me pulled back and looked at me with both eyes. She had been crying, but her face was level, the way her face was always level when she had decided how she was going to be. "Now," she said very quietly, "now you need to let me do something for you." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I know that," she said. "That's not why." We rode back to Cutter's Fork on the stage in the 3rd week of May. She sat across from me this time, facing forward. She spent the first hour of the ride looking at things, just looking, her head turning slowly, taking it in. The country she'd ridden through with one clouded eye for 6 years. The grass going green in the low places where the snowmelt fed it. A creek running fast and brown with spring water. The shapes of the hills to the north, which were particular shapes, this specific range, these specific cuts of rock, that she had seen as shapes for 6 years without being able to see them whole. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. A woman rediscovering the full width of the world doesn't owe you a commentary on it. At one point, somewhere around the 2nd hour, she reached across and put her hand on my arm and kept it there. She wasn't looking at me when she did it. She was looking out the window at the hills, watching them pass. That was the moment. Not the surgery and not the long winter and not the cracked ribs or the $41. That hand on my arm, quiet and sure, while she was busy looking at something else. Like the reaching was as natural as breathing. Like I was something she had already decided was hers to hold onto. We pulled into Cutter's Fork just before dark. The stage driver hollered the arrival, and a few people came out to see who'd come in. Hector Birch was there, and old Mrs. Kinner from the church, and 2 men from the dry goods end of town who were always around when anything was happening. Me stepped down from the stage and looked around. She looked at the street and at the building fronts and at the mountains that you can see clearly from Cutter's Fork on a clear evening, the peaks still white with late snow. She looked at them for a long moment. Birch nodded to her. Mrs. Kinner came over and me talked to her briefly, quietly, and Mrs. Kinner put her hand on me's arm in the way older women do when they are moved and trying not to show it too much. Then me turned and looked back at me, both eyes clear and level. She said in front of all of them, "Come to dinner tomorrow." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. Birch was looking between us with the expression of a man working something out. He'd have it figured by morning. There's a thing I want to say about that winter and what it did to me. I came into Cutter's Fork that November with $41, a hollow feeling, and no road. I'd have told you I was past the age for roads. Past the age for being wanted in a particular way by a particular person. Past the age for believing that doing a thing right would be seen and honored by somebody worth honoring. I'd spent 30 years being competent and reliable and steady, and for most of those years it had felt like shouting into weather, the work got done, and that was good, but nobody was keeping track. And after a while the question of whether it mattered started to go quiet in a way that worried me, because things that go quiet don't always come back. Me Aldrin sat in a chair all night by my stove because she'd decided I was worth staying for. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't hold it over me. She just stayed, and in the morning she told me not to stop, and I believed her. I got up off that floor and I worked a hard winter, and I carried her to the one man who could give her back what had been taken from her. That's the whole of it. I'm not saying it fixed everything. There's no fixing 30 years. There's no undoing my brother's letter or what it meant, or the long trail of days that led to a rented room above a saddle shop with nothing but a thin coat and worse prospects. What I'm saying is that after May of that year, I started keeping track of what I had instead of what I'd lost. I had the livery job. I had the room which suited me. I had a man's work to go to every morning, feeding, brushing down, the smell of horses and hay, the particular piece of an early barn before the town woke up. And on most evenings I had me Aldrin's kitchen table, and whatever she'd decided to make, and her voice across from me, and those two dark eyes that had come back to her. She told me once that summer that she'd known what I was doing from the middle of January. Said she'd worked it out from the way I was working, the particular kind of economy I was practicing, the letter she'd seen me write on a Sunday afternoon at her kitchen table when she came in, and I'd tilted the paper and she'd caught the address at the top. Cheyenne, Haverfield, WT. She'd known, and she'd let me do it on my own. She said some men need to complete the thing before they can talk about it. That talking about it first puts a weight on it that makes it smaller. You could have told me, I said. You could have told me, she said. We were on her porch when she said that in the long evening light of late August. The plains were going gold and the cottonwoods were full, and the mountains were that particular blue they go at the end of summer, not quite gray, not quite purple, a color without a good name. The air had that late summer smell, dry grass and something slightly sweet I've never found a name for. Me was looking at the horizon, both eyes open to it. She had a small smile at the corner of her mouth. I watched her and I thought, this is what it is, this right here. A woman who chose to stay when she had reason to go, who wrapped my chest with sure hands in the dark and told me not to stop. Who sat in a chair all night because she had decided something and was staying with it. A woman who looked at me with both eyes and reached across and put her hand on my arm and kept it there without any ceremony whatsoever. Some men go their whole lives and nobody sees that in them. Not the loudness, I don't have loudness, but the steadiness. The willingness. The plain fact of being the kind of man who shows up, who does the work, who holds on to the thing he decides to hold on to. A man who saves a winter's worth of cold and hard work for somebody else's sight. She saw it, she said so, quietly in front of people who would remember. That was enough, more than I'd expected, if I'm honest, more than enough. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll be done. Josiah Pelter. I rode to Renner in June before the heat got bad. Alone. I told me I had business in Renner, which was true if you counted this as business. And I did, because some things are unfinished and they stay unfinished until a man decides to finish them. Was still there, running the same stable, though it had gone to seed some, a hitching rail that needed replacing, a door that hung wrong, hay stacked sloppily in the yard. He was heavier than I'd expected him to be and slower, and his eyes had the red-rimmed, puffy look of a man who had been drinking steadily for years and whose body was starting to argue about it. He was in the stable yard with a pitchfork when I rode up, moving with the careful deliberateness of a big man who has let himself go soft. I told him who I was. I told him about me. I told him what had happened to her eye and what it had cost her, 6 years of half a world, of learning to live tilted into her good side, of compensating in the thousand small ways a person compensates when something has been taken from them that should never have been taken. I didn't mention the dollars. Money wasn't the point. He went through his stages. Said he didn't remember, I let him say that. Said she must have been exaggerating, that it couldn't have been that bad, I let him say that too. By the time he'd run through them all, he was looking at me differently, the way a man looks when he's taken the measure of someone standing in front of him and decided he doesn't like the conclusion. What I said next, I said quietly. I found that things said quietly by a man of a certain build and a certain age and a certain set to the jaw tend to carry more weight than shouting. I told him what I expected of him. I told him how I expected the rest of his years to go on the subject of me, Aldrin, and people like her. I told him what would happen if I had reason to come back to Renner. He took it in, he didn't say much. What he said was careful. I rode back to Cutter's Fork, and I didn't tell me I'd gone to Renner. Not for a few months. That fall, when the evenings got short, and we were in the habit by then of sitting on her porch in the last of the day's light, she asked me why I'd seemed quieter for a few days back in June. I told her. She was still for a moment, listening to what I told her, looking at the mountains. Then she said, "Thank you." That was it, 2 words. The way she said them, quiet and complete, no more ceremony than they needed, was the whole of it. I've carried those 2 words ever since. Some things a man does because they need doing, and there's nobody else to do them. Some things he does because he has been given a reason to be the kind of man who does them. A reason that has a name and dark eyes, and a hand that reaches across without looking. That's enough, that is enough for any man,